there is a bias at the BBC.
I think BBC TV comedy has been a woeful failure on that front. It does seem to me that there seems to be a preponderance of evidence to suggest that the BBC news department do have a pro-Palestinian bias. And independent organisations have pointed to, I think, about 1,500 examples. It's interesting, isn't it, about the Daily Mail and the Telegraph too, as well, who used to be bastions of the right, but they've been infiltrated to some extent.
Hey, what's gone on?
Well. The far right bogeyman thing is always reached for. Obviously, you can understand why Starmer is going to do that in order to lock people up. I think with mass immigration, if you feel about it the way that some people do, that is an existential threat. We've seen levels of immigration we hadn't dreamt of previously.
A few years ago, you said on Trigonometry
yes.
that there is a bias at the BBC. Has your opinion changed?
Oh my God, we're going straight in on the career-ending stuff.
Yes.
Is there a bias at the BBC? Well, I was only talking, obviously, about panel games and comedy shows, and I did perceive that there was one then, and I still perceive there is one now, although I will accept radio. I think Radio 4 is actually quite generous. And seeks to redress that balance. I think they're aware of it, and I think they know of the structural challenges that they face. I think BBC TV comedy has been a woeful failure on that front for most of the time that I've been a stand-up comic. The difficulty of saying as much, of course, is that it just sounds like sour grapes. You're just going, I haven't been on Have I Got News for You? There can only be one possible reason for this.
You've written stuff that's on, not going out. You wrote with...
Oh, I've written stuff for completely neutral stand. Lee Mack's amazing sitcom, which in a way is quite right-wing, insofar as it's very traditional. It's a family structure, and it doesn't have all sorts of forced diversity. But yeah, I did one Mock the Week and no other panel games. And there aren't that many other right-wing comedians. They have always said, and there's probably a lot of people who read it and go, yeah, that's true, that they would love to have more, varied political views on, but there just aren't any right-wing comedians out there for them to use. And that was the point at which, they literally did say that. And that was the point at which I said, well, now I start to feel a little bit like, hello.
Insulted. Yeah. There aren't any good ones left. Yeah, that's what we're saying. Well, there's you, Jeff Norcott, and Henning Vane. Would that be one? Well,
Jeff has certainly been on Have I Got News, and he is, we're slightly different politically. I would say he's right of centre, but he's kind of more in the, and you could argue, is it a jokey premise anyway? Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And that's not a criticism. It's just a different, we all plough our own furrow, whereas my stuff is more esoteric, I think. And then Henning is brilliant again, but Henning, I don't know what you would call Henning. He's very sui generis, really.
Yeah, German.
Yeah, German and kind of sneering at the English for everything being a bit hapless and pathetic,
Yeah, well, fair play. It's I used to live in Germany and nobody knows who he is out there. I would always say, there's this great German comedian, Henning Vane, and no.
Benny Hill, we like the Benny Hill and the Norman Wisdom.
Das liken wir. Wir liken the Benny Hill. You work.
They like Steptoe, I think, or Steptoe something they like, or maybe Hancock. I think they like some old 60s sitcoms, yeah.
Gosh, I'm not surprised. You were concerned at the time on Trig that the BBC would lose the trust of the nation and the world. Has that gone further? How are people now?
Well, perhaps you're thinking of the way they've covered Gaza, which is, I'm not fully equipped to speak about bias within a news organisation. It does seem to me that there seems to be a preponderance of evidence to suggest that the BBC news department do have a pro-Palestinian bias, and independent organisations have pointed to, I think, about 1,500 examples,
right.
This is, as I say, I'm out of my comfort zone a little bit. I'm happy to give you my opinion, but it's not an expert opinion.
Yeah, I'll just delete that bit.
Yeah.
Go on.
There are different cultures within the BBC. This is the thing. I don't know who was it who said politics is downstream of culture. Was that Breitbart, I think, maybe first said that? But
I don't know.
But that's a thing within organisations as well as countries. The office politics is downstream of the office culture, And it's not easy for an individual to come in at the top and say, here are the new guidelines, and you can pin them up on the notice board. You're not to be beastly to the Jews. But, if that's how they are, that's how they'll be, and if that's in one of the famous examples was the extent to which the Guardian newspaper was the in-house newspaper, and probably still is, and was just understood.
So? Is that
well,
right?
It was within the BBC generally, and I know within the comedy department to some extent as well. Not that there are plenty of people I know, friends of mine, who regard the Guardian as captured, as a sort of what is the term they would use, like the
Groniads.
Yeah, but it's a safe, like, it allows a little bit of steam to come out. It allows a little bit of left-wing steam to come out, but no one's going to overturn the regime. That kind of thing, like Russell Brand would say, that they're just two buttocks of the same arse, the right and left. You're not going to get any distinct revolution or a Chomsky type analysis. Well, they wouldn't, if the Guardian was going to change anything, it would be banned. So I'm not saying it's like a really hard left bias. It's just a slightly, they're dubious. I mean, all these things with Israel and Gaza, it's fascinating if you want to just detach it from the horrors, that both sides have experienced. But it is interesting. I didn't realise until somebody started sharing a clip from Yes Minister that was about 30 years old, or maybe Yes Prime Minister, in which it's explained by Sir Humphrey to Jim Hacker that it's kicked off in Israel in 1981 or whatever it is, and Jim Hacker is we need to stand by our allies, Israel. And Sir Humphrey says, well, I'm afraid you're probably aware, sir, but the Foreign Office is traditionally an Arabist institution. Our sympathies are with the Arabs. And this is, this is the deep history. There are different layers. You all think, Western democracies tend to support Israel and look the other way during its so-called atrocities, or whether you believe they are. But maybe things are changing, and as demography changes in this country and in America, their governments. But actually, in this country, more traditionally, the Foreign Office as a civil service department was sympathetic to. We had connections with Oman. We have the oil industry to think of course. We have very strong relationship with Jordan, whereas Israel was seen as a sort of an American garrison or an American aircraft carrier almost that was sort of settled in the sea of sand, And from that point of view, America is our traditional enemy. That whole special relationship thing is on very thin ice and always has been, because America did what it could to destroy the British Empire, during the World War era, and so there's no love lost there, if you know what I mean. So it's never quite as simple as it seems, I think, and the BBC is just another place that has its culture.
Do you think it has become or is likely to get worse? Because you mentioned demography changes.
There
are not many Jews in this country, very few. I know there's
stable population, I would say, roughly.
It's something like 0.4% or something of the country.
Is it that few?
Yeah, it's
I'm surprised.
a couple hundred.
I guess I work in an industry where they preponderate more. But
would that be comedy or media?
Oh,
both.
Splash. I would say both. Yeah, comedy. I think. My Jewish connection. Do you know that I'm half Jewish?
No.
I'm
sorry to hear that.
That's all right. I'm half Jewish through. I was donor conceived. I was the product of artificial insemination, and I only found this out about 6 years ago. It's just coming up to the 6th anniversary, in fact. So in 1964, my parents, after 8 years of frustratingly fruitless engagement, decided to get some tests done. It turned out my poor old dad, who's still alive, bless him, at the age of 94, was shooting blanks, and so they went to a fertility clinic in central London. Yeah, synagogue. Yeah, that would have been like the beginning of A Serious Man. Yeah, what can we do?
Yes.
But so they went to a fertility clinic, and it was run by a Jewish man called Bertolt Wiesner and his wife, Mary Barton, who was not Jewish. And he was a very eminent fertility scientist. He'd left Austria in the maybe the 20s, actually, I think, and worked in Edinburgh for some time, developed pretty much the world's first reliable pregnancy testing kit. He had sort of serious game in the area. And his wife was a regular obstetrician and fertility clinic. She'd run them in India and stuff as well. And anyway, nobody knew at the time that Wiesner himself was providing the vast majority, the lion's share of the sperm that was getting these women pregnant.
Oh my God.
So I was one of the last of a vast cohort, and they are continuing to come to light through DNA testing. This is how I learned. I had no idea. And they were that wasn't like bad practice. It was emphasized to them that they should not, to my parents, were told not to say anything because it could be stigmatized, it could be psychologically damaging. And also, I suspect, perhaps in hindsight, because they were worried that it might eventually get out that, there were just hundreds, if not over 1,000, possibly little Wiesners running around.
Wow.
But so I've discovered that I was Jewish, and I managed to. I mean, it was a gift for a show,
because he's Jewish. This Wiesner character.
Wiesner is an Austrian Jew, as he came over to Britain in the 1920s, long before fascism. Anyway, he wasn't a sort of refugee, and just seeking scientific advancement. Worked at Edinburgh University for a while, and he knew many of the great figures in eugenics and stuff, and he knew Aldous Huxley, and he knew H.P.S. Haldane and people. And so it's quite an exciting sort of lineage to have, but also a little bit alarming that, as far as I know, I could be bumping into brothers and sisters, from one day to the next. You never know.
Imagine if I revealed now that.
Of course, it's always possible. But the thing I think is that it did click with me that it was, I had entered what is so traditionally a Jewish profession.
That's funny.
It's quite funny, yeah. I think Jews are I think you can make a pretty solid case that stand-up is Jewish. And my other DNA is Celtic.
Okay.
That's through my mother's side.
Yeah.
And the other stand-ups in this country is like the Celtic folk tradition, Billy Connolly and, people like that. So I was destined. Weirdly, although he was a scientist, and I know about 70 or 80 of my brothers and sisters now, none of them have gone into science. Loads of them are in media and, as I say, leveraging a superficial facility with language to earn a living, journalist, PR, that sort of thing.
Interesting. Bloody hell.
Yeah.
That's I did see there was a video on trigonometry about
that one, yeah.
I just didn't get time to watch that because I watched the other full episode and it wasn't in that one.
Sure.
But so there is bias at the BBC. What about? I mean, okay, so you are one of the many brilliant presenters at GB News. There has been of late, since Keir Starmer came in the UK, there has been something of some might say collusion, but some might say just the same opinion from The Guardian, The Daily Mail, and Keir Starmer, which is that the far right is bad.
Yeah.
And thrown into that is social media and probably GB News. What do you say to that?
You mean in terms of the riots that broke out after the Southport
I think so.
killing?
Far right, get rid of, they're all bad. Yeah. We need more free speech stopping because of these evil people.
It's interesting, isn't it, about the Daily Mail and to some extent the Telegraph too as well, who used to be bastions of the right, but they've been infiltrated to some extent lately.
What's gone on?
As well. I don't understand all the full internal dynamics or politics of it, but obviously different owners, and there's a sort of surging and roiling within the editorial departments. They still also publish a good deal of very base stuff. My friend Sam Ashworth-Hayes, who works at the Telegraph, is a very sound individual.
Did you say based?
Based, yeah.
Everyone's saying based. I no matter how many times it's explained to me, I can't quite work out the meaning.
Well, not dealing in fashionable lies, I suppose, seeing reality for what it is. But I think, the far right bogeyman thing is always is reached for. Obviously, you can understand why Starmer is going to do that in order to lock people up, because you can't just say I've locked you up because you're sort of football hooligan. You've got to represent some kind of serious political danger or threat. Far right is one of those weird terms. Obviously, it's a movable feast. I would say, when I was growing up, it probably meant something slightly different from what it means now. I think now it is 95% about it being immigration critical, you would say, and it's just quite
trans as well.
Yeah, a little bit, but I feel like the trans thing is still kind of froth, actually. I don't think anyone really believes that the future of the country is in danger because of trans. I think what they feel like we have to hold the line with, and I'm not saying you can ask me what I think personally, but this is what I'm saying about what you would perceive as the right-wing position on trans. It's something against which we must hold the line and, speak with clarity and firmness to our own children and make sure that they are not getting indoctrinated in schools and there's not this kind of social contagion. Close the clinics, make sure that people aren't going on to, medically irreversible procedures and so on before they're old enough to vote, that kind of stuff. But once it's passed, I think it'll be passed. That's fine. Whereas I think with mass immigration, if you feel about it the way that some people do, that is an existential threat to how England has been for 100,000 years or whatever. So that's a very different level of seriousness. And that, I think, is And I've spoken in particular with Jewish friends, even before I knew I was one among them, about that danger which they acknowledge, left-wing, even a couple of Corbynite Jewish friends, and there are Corbynite Jews, I say Corbynite, but like certainly people who thought that it was a scam, as they say, he was being tarnished or whatever in order to keep him out.
Hasidics as well like him. So the Hasidics, the Haredi communities, they like Corbyn.
Yeah, well, some people, I felt he was more unfit to govern because of his sympathy for the IRA, frankly, than for one. But Venezuela, for one, and also just generally that he just didn't seem to me to be of the right stature. But I didn't have a problem with him being a backbenchy, and a voice speaking out against Afghan war or whatever. But anyway, the point is, they would say, and I agree, that if you allow unchecked mass immigration across Europe, and there are various countries which have a tradition of developing a proper far-right movement, and you're seeing that now, right? You're seeing that obviously in Germany, you're seeing that obviously in the Netherlands, and it could very easily, Macron, I don't know, he's obviously a clever character and gets things more than I do, but he seems to me to be playing on a very high wire at the moment. And it's kind of funny in a way. It's kind of ironic that Britain leaves in 2000. We vote Brexit and everyone thinks, is it going to be a domino? No, it's not a domino. We move out and immediately sort of swing left. And now to be honest, Boris Johnson's government, after it in 2019, obviously it was sort of overwhelmed anyway by COVID. But his policies, as far as immigration were concerned, were extraordinarily liberal. The idea that he, achieved Brexit and then brought up the shutters, or the portcullis was lowered. No, we've seen levels of immigration we hadn't dreamt of previously.
Yeah, are they sort of backed themselves into a corner because we haven't encouraged families to have kids. We need more of that fella who might be your father to.
Well, it's kind of ironic, isn't it? Yes, because the other thing he contributed to world society was the pill. He after me, while he was getting mothers pregnant, he was also involved in developing the birth control pill, which is the single greatest reason why there aren't so many anymore.
That's really interesting. Yeah, so, and it's a great thing, the pill, because it's allowed us to enjoy ourselves unfettered for quite some time. But however,
you should listen to Christopher Hitchens speaking on Firing Line with William Buckley Hill. Not Buckley Hill. That was the Free Fringe guy, isn't he? William F. Buckley, editor of National Review, left and right, talking about the 60s and whether or not it had been. The hedonism had amounted to sex or just masturbation, really.
Interesting. Yeah. Interesting. But look, we're at a point now where we're not having children at a fast enough rate. And so we need to help the aging population as a growing aging population. And so that seems to be the myopic bringing people in is the way to fix the whole.
Myopic's good. Well, it's very hard to know, isn't it, what the different agenda of different people calling for it might be. Some people do seem to regard diversity as a good in and of itself. And I think there certainly was a feeling, there's a famous leaked memo or something, wasn't there, from one of Blair's cabinet meetings talking about rubbing the right's face in diversity. It was quite a deliberate thing in order to undermine the sort of right-wing hegemony in London and further afield. And I think led ultimately to Brexit. I think people were alarmed by the speed of change to some extent. These things always have an over-counter reaction, an unintended consequence. But I think there was a report released this week, wasn't there, or last week, from the Office of Budgetary Responsibility at the OBR or something, demonstrating basically that it's not working in that regard, that generally speaking, although it's increased GDP and total GDP per capita has fallen with mass migration, broadly speaking, unless you select very carefully for certain skill levels or whatever, you are going to introduce just as many people who will be a lifetime burden on the state as you are. So even though, yes, we arguably need to sort of bulk out the middle-aged, middle-class, hard-working in order to support the pensioners, if all you bring in is other net beneficiaries of the state, well, obviously that's not helping at all.
That's a good point. Yeah. That's good. And I suppose also it's a never-ending problem because you bring those people in, so then it's a bigger, but then that they'll get older, and then we need even more to keep filling. I do wonder sometimes.
I think there's a lot, as I get older, maybe, but also, we could have a whole conversation about a guy called Arthur Herman wrote a book called The Idea of Decline in Western Civilization. 2,000 years of people going, it's all going to crap now. It was like in 1200, in 1500. So we've always thought that. We've always thought that. We are just a very pessimistic people, and in particular, I think Christian tradition Tolkien famously said, Catholicism is basically a question of coming to terms with long, eternal, decline and failure, with one glorious end to the whole thing. But I wonder sometimes whether we're all secretly at the back of our minds have sort of given up. We think of this climate change is going to destroy everything soon anyway. We're either hoping that there's an AGI revolution and all the robots come in the nick of time to save us or destroy us. That the singularity everything will be written off. So we're just looking more and more short term. But sadly, I think, humans are very short term driven. Most of our technological innovations, certainly since, the Second World War, seem to have been vastly more focused on increasing convenience and just like ironing out little wrinkles. Rather than the great surging way forward, the development of the railways or the or steam power. It's been much more about apps, of late, and it's pretty sad, really. I mean, I even think that about the built environment, which seems horribly degraded to me. London, you get out of Victoria Station, as I do, and you're just confronted immediately with ugliness on a scale that I just don't understand how everyone's putting up with it.
What, ugly people?
Ugly people, yeah. But no, I mean architecture, where the sort of just this kind of it's like Guernica or something. You come out, it's like a cubist painting, there's the old Shakespeare pub, a sort of 19th century gin house, with the massive sort of shard of glass and steel and then bus lanes all around.
Isn't that the charm of London?
No, that isn't the charm. The charm used to be a sort of spaghetti of winding alleyways, but it was all a little bit either Dickensian, George. I mean, yes, the city of London has like the Gherkin with a little pub in front of it, that kind of thing works. Yeah. Victoria Station, it's unless you've actually seen what I'm talking about, it's hard to explain. But my point is this. I think people live with that level of ugliness now because they are already migrating into their screens. They already basically live in the virtual world. They all, we all walk around staring.
We're sort of
screens.
Just going, it doesn't matter, fuck it. Soon we'll be completely in there.
4-inch square and everything else is a blur.
With regard to short-termism, I suppose, it's something that goes unsaid because everybody wants to show what a good person they are. But how much do we really care about the world beyond our own? The average person. I'm sure some people will be shouting, listening to this, I care a lot. But okay, your kids, your grandkids, maybe your great-grandkids. Do you really? Do I need this Earth to be in thousands of years going if I'm not part of it? I mean, there are probably billions of other planets like Earth. We're not the only ones.
Well, I do have children now, and that does change your mind a bit. Although even then, I don't, really, honestly, truly think about what's going to happen in 50 years' time. Because I kind of think, in a way, you would go crazy. And actually, I think my wife, wants to keep their water wings on for as long as possible. And I'm like, they are 17 and 20 now. They need to start learning to be adaptable. If they need to develop gills, they'll need to develop gills,
Bloody hell.
And
but it doesn't seem, it was what you said, it's always doom, isn't it? We're always about to, I used to look into cults. Every single cult has a different, how the world is going to end.
Millennium or millenarian, isn't it?
Yeah. That whole thing. And so I don't know. The climate thing could happen tomorrow, but
it's not just climate though, is it? There's a sort of sense that it's that whole Spengler thing, the decline of the West. It's not just like, I do think, China or South Korea or Japan, they have their fertility problems, of course, they have their demographic challenges, but a lot of their cities seem to work in a way that, if you get the tube south from Victoria down to Stockwell now, the screaming, the absolute roar of like grating steel on
northern
steel.
Line, that's the Northern Line.
It's so insanely loud. Horrible. And obviously like broken, and then you get on like the Elizabeth line, which is the one, 21st century mass transit system in London, and it's like the rest of the world is living like that now.
It's like
basically, Shanghai and Beijing and Singapore, they all live on the Elizabeth line, whereas we have one thing like that. And
I will change my plans to avoid going on the Northern line. I'll say, look, I'm not going to come to your party. I'll go somewhere else that's on the Elizabeth line.
Can we go somewhere on the... Yeah, exactly. I feel exactly the same way.
I'm from the north of London, so it's always the north bit of the Northern line, but it's the same noise. It's horrific. But that's, of course, Shanghai and all of those. But I lived in Buenos Aires, and it's a mess, those kinds of things.
Yes.
But Berlin,
well, that
mess.
Was one that, I've never been to Buenos Aires. I'd love to spend some time in South America, but that was nearly there, wasn't it? Early 20th century Buenos Aires and New York.
Oh yeah,
neck and neck, could have gone either way, and people have different theories about that.
We built their tube, so maybe that's why it's all falling apart. We did. We built a lot of all that stuff.
We built a lot of stuff. We built the Japanese Navy, didn't we?
Apparently,
that was an error.
Is that right? The other thing, okay, one of the reasons I think that, we were talking about the Guardian, the Telegraph, and the Daily Mail all being sort of together with the politician, which is an odd place to be in, because they're supposed to be there to hold the politicians and the powerful to account, and they're all going, yes, you're right, this far right. I think what it might have to do with is, I used to work at the Sun when I was like 21 or something, but I remember every day all anyone spoke about was their market share compared to, especially online, compared to Mail Online, compared to all the others. The Sun was losing out big time. That's all they care about, is the bottom line.
Yeah.
And now social media accounts for 30% of people's news consumption.
Wow.
So that must be...
You mean people sharing legacy media content via social media?
I think not just legacy media. I think most of it will be sharing maybe GB News, sharing my stuff, sharing trigonometry stuff, sharing all of that stuff. That's huge competition. If you're a company, which, the Daily Mail, all those things, that's all you really care about. So now they are sort of, it's a bit conspiratorial, I suppose, but that, money is what drives them.
Well, again, you could say the idea of decline, the idea, there's a parallel thing of the idea of the race to the bottom, the paring down, the reduction of chewiness, the removal of nutrients and bones or anything that might cause any kind of pause. You will almost reverting to nursery food, and this again is something that has been feared and complained about and written about. There's a book I never get tired of quoting called Amusing Ourselves to Death, originally a series of lectures by a guy called Neil Postman, which sounds like a funny name, but anyway, he was a bit like Marshall McLuhan, a sort of media expert, and he gave these lectures after the election of Ronald Reagan, which he saw as the beginning of the end. Reagan being an actor rather than a serious politician. We are entering, he said, the televisual era, rather than what he regarded as the typographic era, when people expressed and consumed their political thought through print. And he talked about the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which is when Abraham Lincoln and Douglas, I don't know what his name was, not Frederick, did like a tour of America, and people would go and listen to them for like 3 or 4 hours. They would go home and have their dinner and come back, and they'd still be debating the political issues of the day. It's unthinkable now,
Well, it's coming back. Jordan Peterson does those kinds of things. Douglas Murray.
Absolutely right. I think that's a really encouraging, aspect of podcasting or the YouTube sphere is the long term. People have an appetite for it again. But he in 1984 thought that was over, and we were getting towards the soundbite. But, as you say, there's just this constant, it churns, and people now look back at Ronald Reagan as a sort of, one of the high points of the American century, really, the defeat of the evil empire and Reagan's kind of calm patrician confidence. By comparison with Donald Trump, he just seemed to have an extraordinary sort of patina of old school charm. Sure. Long Island, So there's just constantly this sort of thing. Oh God, where is our audience? Where is our traction going to come from? And people have had to adapt. I remember Donald Trump used to talk about the failing New York Times with some force, although it was obviously just one of his epithets. The New York Times had failed to adapt, I believe, at one point, and Facebook essentially was creaming off all the revenue that should rightfully have been the New York Times. But I think they've changed. I don't know too much about the detail, but I believe they've adapted to that and they're back on track now.
The membership models supporting them.
Which infuriate me, because I did sign up to the New York Times one, but then every time you want to read something, you have to sort of log in, and it just gets very tiresome, doesn't it?
Because I think if you accept cookies, and I'll tell you later. I'll tell you later. But
these things are not for granddads, but there's more content than I can read anyway.
But the thing is, the New York Times is going to be okay, but I think the market share of the UK newspapers, I think they are concerned. People are getting their news from TikTokers and YouTubers and those kinds of things, and so now they've got to portray them. They had to side with Keir, I think, because in favour of more censorship of social media.
You're quite right. I'm sure that as much as the far right were the bogeymen, the idea of just people who hadn't got fact checkers in their office who couldn't claim their sources, and that was why they wanted to portray Bernie Spofforth, who she was a tweeter and Facebooker who she was one of the ones who was arrested but let go, but she was the one who went, word is going around that the Southport killer is this man, and he's known to MI6 and he's on a watch list.
Which is bad to do.
If this is true, all hell will break loose. She did say if this is true, but maybe it was, I do personally deplore the appetite that people have, the naked thirst to be first with that kind of news, to be some kind of nexus, Why would you want to be the person that somebody read that and went, right, that's enough. I've had enough of this. I'm going to go down and throw a brick through the mosque window.
Because if it is true, it will get lots and lots of likes and retweets, and that person their next stuff will get more posts and things, and then they'll be able to, and they'll start a career. So they are incentivized to do it.
Dysfunctional incentives, absolutely. Yeah.
The situation we're in now.
Yeah.
It's really tough. I try to hold tight, and then sometimes I get people, Andrew, why aren't you tweeting about it? I was like, well, let me wait to make sure that the stabber is actually Muslim before even making it, and then they weren't.
But even, I mean, I was presenting on GB News one of the nights. I can't remember if it was the first night after the killings or the second. And I said something about, I believe a man was arrested making his way to the demo with a knife, and a man of apparently or rumoured to be of Muslim appearance. Well, that was, I mean, I think I covered myself, and I didn't hear anything from management or anything else. But I was just trying to say what I'd read in newspapers and why people thought that it was.
Police are waiting outside.
But
mate.
exactly before it's so difficult. It's a little bit like, it's not quite the same, but it's a little bit like that spate, which seems to have calmed down a bit now, where people were being arrested for like quoting rap lyrics that had the N-word in and things. You know what I mean? Or like even saying, I don't like the way they say the what. Do you know what I mean? And you sort of go, how can we talk about this if we can't even talk about,
If someone says, I don't like the Jews, they're welcome. I'm Jewish. They're welcome to, what do I care? Go and do your thing. You can have, I'd rather know. But
at least if somebody says, I don't like the Jews, and you want to say, well, that's anti-Semitic, then at least you know they've been anti-Semitic. But if you say it's problematic to say, as you just did, if somebody was to say, I don't like the Jews, and you went, oh my God, he said the J word, that's the kind of level of stupid we're at in some regards now. Do you know what I mean? Would you
say the N word? Is that something if you're talking to a friend?
I think it would. I wouldn't want to take that risk because it has absolutely no upside to me at all. I have no temptation to say it, and I'm not interested in rap music, and I'm not interested in like P. Diddy or Kanye or any of that stuff. Although those, however florid those scandals are, sometimes I just. It's like curtains for what is that phrase?
I have no idea what this could possibly be.
There's a famous tweet. I can't remember his name. Damon, someone. He was an Irish comic, very funny, and he said that once you pass the age of 50, half of social media tweets read like this, and then it was like some made-up curtains for Yasmoth, and
just different language.
Exactly. Just going, what the hell is going on?
Well, Diddy's been doing some bad things.
Yeah,
for many decades.
There's a lot worse than the N-word coming out of there. But the N-word thing, it's a palpably absurd, social construct and a place we've arrived at. And yet I have no interest, or I don't feel deprived. Sure. So, I pick my battles.
But people have lost their jobs for describing why you shouldn't say that word and saying the word.
A science teacher on a coach on a field trip or something, wasn't he? I think,
I did a talk yesterday. I was telling you just before about the changing nature of offence. It's from John McWhorter. He wrote this Nine Nasty Words. It was all about swear words and things. It's a fascinating book. And you can trace how offence and sacred words have changed over the years, because when it was more religion, it was stuff like hell and damn. They were the things you couldn't say. And that sounds hysterical to us now. Like, what a silly bunch of people they were. And then you get, it went to the bodily and the more sort of selfish, because we became...
the vulgar.
So fuck shit, all those kinds of things. There's one word, which I can't even say on this because YouTube won't like it, which is the C word, which was one of those words.
It's still slightly more shocking than the others, just
because we moved on to identity, and it still has some place in identity, that C word, because it's misogynist.
Yeah.
So it's seen as part of that.
And in America, they use that word of women sometimes, don't they? Men will use it of a woman,
which we wouldn't do here.
I had enough of her. She was a
I
would never. I don't think I've ever heard a man use it unless my wife uses that word a lot.
I thought you were going to say my wife is one.
Yeah, she uses it to describe like traffic wardens or some irritant in her daily life. Quite happily, not. Maybe in front of the kids now, 17 and 20, but not when they were younger. But quite happily. And we also use it as an adjective. We put ing on the end.
That's nice.
And that's quite funny. It sort of takes the heat out of it a little bit, But neither of us ever, use any racial slurs because it just doesn't occur to you, But there's a slight difference between, that thing of people saying, you nobody lives in a prison cell until they test the door. That's the.
Well, it's also, I don't like that.
McWhorter is fantastic, by the way. I do just want to say,
McWhorter.
And his discussions with Glenn Lowry.
Oh yeah, they're great.
There's a particular that the really articulate, thoughtful, high-energy black conservative commentators. It's a particular flavour, isn't it, that you get in America?
Yeah,
haven't quite nailed that here at the moment.
No, but we don't have as many black people.
No, I guess that's it. But they are so good.
Yeah, they are really good.
Wilfred Riley's another one.
Wilfred Riley,
really excellent. Yeah.
When I was just going to say when you talk about your wife and at home, and it's an interesting thing thinking about what we're like in the home. Yeah. And the first line of my wedding, my not best man. What am I? Groom. I was the groom. The groom's speech was, you found the one, or you're truly. I can't remember how it was. You're truly in love when you found someone you can be racist with, and that's, I think, is a Louis C.K. line.
Yeah.
And I just loved it. This idea that there is someone you can be at home with who is just like, you can actually be your true, whatever that is.
Yeah, yeah.
And you're right. Like, who has an urge to say the N-word? I don't have that urge.
I think the funny thing, I mean, it's a great joke, and I think Louis C.K.
Well, you didn't laugh, mate.
Louis C.K. was a superb comic, and was very sad about the difficulties he got into.
The difficulties he got into in a plant.
Well, I mean, there was that whole kind of like the dam burst, didn't it, with Me Too, and I didn't feel his offences were anything like on a par with the.
I thought they were. I'm sort of alone.
You really thought he was disgusting?
I thought it was quite bad, and I'm one of his biggest.
It's unpleasant. It's more humiliating to him. But I mean, I don't know. Sarah Silverman seemed to be okay with it. She seemed to say that everyone was just like, "Oh, it's just Louis." But anyway, not going down that rabbit hole. His stuff about using words, and he talks about using the word faggot, right? That's a lot. There's a whole massive routine, and that was a massive sitcom episode. Very, very funny. But it turns back on him, and he learns that actually it was hurtful to gay people in his circle when he thought it was just not being. So it's, there's a learning goes on there. But it is an American thing, that race in America has been like the fundamental hinge, point, the inflection point for comedy for as long as I can remember. Like in the 60s, it was already there. Jewish comics, black comics, or comics, any stand-up comic in America was, I'm half Italian and half Armenian, so I do this, but I do that. British comics really are still learning about that. There are some new arrivals who do it, but it's not bubbling up out of, it never used to come. Our big thing was class always, right? So you would have Mannering and Faulty and Hyacinth Bouquet, all of the great sitcom characters really were about class anxiety, upper, lower middle class people desperately trying to get themselves into the safe middle. That kind of thing. Steptoe and Son. Steptoe wants to make himself into a middle class, and he's being dragged back down by the crab of his father, and all of that kind of stuff. It's a super, and it still is there, I think, if you want it. But obviously, it's become more mixed now. But there's been laughter this week at the expense of Kemi Badenoch for claiming working class credentials for having had a Saturday job at McDonald's for a couple of weeks. Right. Everyone has still got class anxiety. Yeah. You don't get that in America. But when we talk about race, it comes off different, I think. It lands differently,
Interesting. Yeah, Keir's dad's a toolmaker.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, what is that? What's a toolmaker?
Well, and some people say, well, it's actually, I mean, it could be quite a serious and highly skilled job, couldn't it? It could be like creating parts for machines, which I guess would be an engineer, really, but I don't know.
Tools. We need to look into this, though. Yeah. What tools were made?
He's made one spanner. Yeah. I mean, you can't make them by hand, can you?
Or was that his part-time job after working in the city for the afternoon? What did he do? People have made a lot about the toolmaker thing, haven't they? Because, yes.
Well, he goes back to it again and again, and then he did that horrible cringe thing where people laughed at him, and he pretended to think that they were laughing at his dad for being a toolmaker, not at him for endlessly bringing this up at the slimmest opportunity.
God.
So anyway, he's a wrong and that's being exposed now.
He's it's an odd one, because before he got into power, I actually saw him as not for me, but maybe he seems like a nice fella. And suddenly I'm seeing him through just a totally different lens now. He just looks so dour.
Well, I remember when he stood for the leadership contest when Corbyn was going, and the Guardian again had a sort of photo, half the top half of the page was about the leadership hopefuls. And there were 4 women and Starmer. And Starmer was bottom right in this sort of montage, and the Guardian logo was over half of his face. They were really trying to make out like, oh, and there's Keir Starmer. And I was like, it's going to be Keir Starmer, because Labour are weirdly conservative in that regard. Conservatives have half their cabinet are people of colour, and they've had 3 leaders now, and it's neck and neck with Badenoch, and generally she might be the 4th, and she will be the first black leader, and Labour has just Labour has a succession of what looked like Father of the Chapel from 1974.
So bizarre, isn't it?
Yeah.
These sort of dour people. Blair had a good look, I think. He had a good look.
Well, he was like a proper modern leader, wasn't he?
Yeah,
I mean, there's certainly a pretty coherent case to be made for him having done the most irresolvable damage to Britain, through the Quangos and so on. I think, he was essentially the long march through the institutions that had been deemed necessary decades earlier, but nobody thought that it would come quite so smartly dressed. But yeah, he was incredibly plausible. I remember there was a book written, a sort of dystopian book called something like Ruler of the World or Master of the World or something, in the 1920s, about the Antichrist, basically, and what he'll look like. And it was almost, it's a picture perfect thumbnail of Blair.
Bloody hell. That Americans writing and see what you think about Quangos and all that. The references to Quangos and are you being served and all. I don't know if you mentioned that. But
I think Americans have, they maybe don't call them Quangos, but they know that there are quasi-autonomous, non-governmental organisations which are used. This is basically what Curtis Yarvin talks about to a large extent, right? You know him?
No.
Curtis Yarvin, who used to blog as Mencius Moldbug, but is now he's a very reactionary right-wing commentator who says that basically good things only happen under monarchs. So, but you can recreate the idea of monarchy by having a CEO essentially making every country a list. But he says your iPad is built by an organisation that is a monarchy. Apple was a monarchy under Steve Jobs. It was not a democracy. If it had been a democracy, that would still be like a drawing in crayon,
It's an interesting...
Yeah. So anyway, he's a really interesting guy and also slightly odd and, a bit weird and twitchy and doesn't quite understand how he comes off when he appears wearing a black leather motorcycle jacket talking about George III. But... he talks about the cathedral. His great creation is that where he was the first to use the term red pill in society. He took that from the Matrix and he said people are getting red pilled when they understand how the world is really organized. So he was the one to introduce the red pill, which has now been adopted by men's rights movements and all the rest of it. But the cathedral, he says, is the sort of the third wing, the third leg of the stool of government. So you have, you have the executive, you have the legal structure, the judges or whatever, you have the king, but then this is in medieval or under monarchy. You need to have the cathedral. People go to church on a Sunday and an apparently independent voice speaking on behalf of God and an irrefutable foundational morality tells them that the king is backed by God.
Right.
The king has God's thumbs up. He has his approval, and that this is the way that the world is unfolding according to God's plan. And if you don't have that, then your legitimacy as a ruler is very fragile. But if you have, it's almost like having an outrider on a boat, or flying buttresses on a cathedral. You have this apparently independent wing that can support and validate and create a sort of illusion of dialogue, whereas in reality they are just another organ of the state.
Sure.
And so in America, he says, obviously the media is a massive part of that, and the other big massive part is academia. And then an academia, of course, provides most of those who go on to work in the media. So basically you need to infiltrate the media and you need to infiltrate academia. And this is why, in his words, Cthulhu swims slowly, but only swims left. So you have this kind of just general tendency for American politics to constantly be being tugged towards the kind of politics of the campus. And then, to some extent, Hollywood, TV or whatever as well, support this. But that's what he calls the cathedral. And there's some force to that argument, I think. And the NGOs were essentially Tony Blair's creation of that. So now you have things like the Roundtree Foundation or whatever, who provide a report, a research has demonstrated that we need to do this, and the government go, oh, we need to do that. Okay, well, let's do that. They're paying the Roundtree Foundation. They're supporting them. It's an illusion, the idea that there's this kind of
independent body,
exactly, yeah.
That's interesting. You recently wrote about, I think it was Joe Lycett, his claims that comedians need to be careful now, and that's a good thing. That's scarily authoritarian sounding, at least.
Yeah. Joe Lycett, I've never met Joe, and I know a lot of people like him very much, and I don't want to sort of like hound the guy. Obviously, he's enormously successful, but he plays, to my mind, with a certain kind of fake ersatz knavery, a sort of, speaking truth to power or pranks, that sort of thing, and yet at the same time is quite judgmental or authoritarian about things he doesn't like.
Yeah, I think that's what we're all concerned. It's sort of woke, isn't it? That's what woke is.
Yeah. But he'll do things like he'll prank Laura Kuenssberg's political discussion show, agree to appear there as a stand-up comic to offer a dialogue or an analysis or whatever, and then he'll pretend to have converted to being a Tory or whatever.
Right.
So it's quite a funny prank, but
fun.
it's very safe. But he's not unhappy about, I think the thing with stand-up is the natural reaction of the audience is as much of a bulwark as you ever need in a live setting to correct your course. Morals change. Yeah, you might say 50 years ago, as I can remember who you mentioned, who said that it used to be different. McWhorter, wasn't it? Who said that in the same way that swearing was 50 years ago, there was a limit to how much you could tell jokes about the royal family or the church, probably, or certain things, and certain people were accorded some respect. And famously, like Peter Cook was the first to start sort of mocking. Poor old Harold Macmillan while he was in the audience, and a cataclysmic moment. But and now it's a different group of people. The danger, I think, always comes with stand-up when people are trying to guess what other people might be offended by. I just don't like that. I don't think that's right. I think you're quite entitled, if you find something not funny, to just sit there and not laugh at it. To give the old hard stare. That's fine. But the ability that certain groups now have to make other people feel anxious that they may be, and it's very rarely the right people.
There's a great article by, do you know Paul Graham? There's a sort of billionaire writer guy.
Yes, Paul G.
Yeah, Paulie G. Paul, is that what people call it?
That's
Paul
his
G?
Twitter handle.
Is
Paul
it?
G,
It's from like 25 years ago, and the article, I think, and it's called something like "What We Can't Say," and it's all about taboo and the changing nature of it. And he just asks at the beginning of the article, he just says, what is there that you fear saying in front of your peers and friends and things like that? And he said, if you can't think of anything, it's likely that you believe what you're told, and therefore you are a conformist. But it's incredibly unlikely that you happen to hold all the right beliefs and they happen to be the ones you've been told.
Well, I think there's an interview, I think it's Noam Chomsky talking to Andrew Marr maybe 20 years ago, and Andrew, I think it was in, what was it, Vine? God, I hope I've got this right. I think it was Chomsky talking to Vine, talking to Marr, and Marr saying, I can say whatever I want on BBC. Honestly, I'm not censored. And Chomsky, if it is Chomsky, says, you've only got where you are because your views conform with those which are sayable, So of course, again, you haven't tested the door of the cage.
The unfortunate thing is that those who are overly educated, I think journalists in particular, are among the most overeducated people, unnecessarily so. We're journalists in a sense ourselves, and you don't need that much. Sorry to journalists.
Well, no, this is a really interesting thing, and a lot of studies have demonstrated this, and I think actually a moment's common sense does as well, that highly intelligent, educated people are more easily persuaded that they have, that they've not been duped, that they're not missing anything. I did a show in Edinburgh about the Scottish Enlightenment this year instead of a stand-up comedy show, and about Adam Smith and David Hume. And Hume in particular was like really good on this. He was maybe the first to really spot the degree to which high intelligence is essentially an engine for hypocrisy. It allows you to provide plausible explanations to yourself for why what you think is right and true.
It's a great book.
It's not necessarily a skill set for finding the truth.
There's a great book called The Intelligence Trap by science writer David Robertson.
Okay.
Quite recent, the last few years. But he used the example of Conan Doyle, Arthur Conan Doyle, that he
spiritualism.
He believed in fairies and things at a time when people didn't believe in fairies.
Bless him.
Despite being a clearly very intelligent person.
I can't remember if he was one of those who'd lost a son in the war. I think it might have been. There was a general surge in spiritualism after World War I. People wanted to believe that they hadn't just lost the flower of manhood for that reason, for nothing. But yes, bizarre. There's another interesting theory about Conan Doyle, which is just mad, but I love it, which is that the first two collections of Sherlock Holmes, at the end of which he falls, in a battle, I can't remember the name of the waterfall, but he goes over the waterfall with Moriarty.
I don't know.
There's two great first collections that they were all written by Edgar Allan Poe, who died before he could publish them, and Conan Doyle came into possession of them, and they end with Sherlock Holmes dying. Then there's no more stories for ages, and then people go, come on, we love Sherlock Holmes, bring him back. So eventually Conan Doyle brings him back, but he's never quite as good. And it is true, the second batch of stories are not quite as good. Of course it's nonsense.
This is Paul McCartney.
But it's marvellous. I love all that
Paul
stuff.
McCartney's dead.
I think it's so interesting.
Shakespeare.
Because Edgar Allan Poe did sort of invent the detective.
Right.
He is credited with doing that. The Murders in the Rue Morgue. There's I think 3 of them, but they are. He didn't write nearly as many as you would hope.
Yeah, interesting. I never really got into them, to be honest. I was never into
Holmes.
Sherlock Holmes. Yeah.
Oh, Holmes is fantastic. Oh, they're as good as anything gets. The first 2 set of stories and the novels as well. They're wonderful. Really good on Audible. Simon Vance. There you go. If you leave this podcast with nothing else, Simon Vance, Audible, the complete works. That is not the whatever you call it. Yeah, the complete Sherlock Holmes.
Who's someone that you've worked with in comedy that's just the best? Who's great? Who's someone?
Well, I don't know about the best. I think the best era for me was kind of when I started, and I was sort of slightly in awe of the people who were at the top of their game then. But I still think the best way to experience a comedy night, annoyingly, really, is a comedy club, like a really good mixed bill, like a gala show or whatever, or even just a really good night at the comedy store, And probably the single best night of comedy I've ever seen. There was one I went to quite early, which was a benefit thing. It was at the Union Chapel in Islington, and that had... it had Harry Hill, Mark Lamar, Jeff Green, Joe Brand, Harry Hill. Well, just like all the people in the mid-90s all doing quite short slots. It was amazing. I saw a night once where Bill Bailey, Eddie Izzard and Harry Hill all did 20-minute set. And that was about as good as I've ever seen anything get. Eddie Izzard's become a little bit annoying now, but he was a fantastic comic for a while. Bill Bailey is possibly my favourite of all time.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, not necessarily for his musical stuff, although I'd like it, and I like the way it breaks things up, But his sort of quasi-philosophical musings and meanderings, and I just.
Graham Linehan's not a fan.
Is he not? Did he let him down?
It was one of those on the list. That Graham told me about, but
I think it was bad what happened to Graham, but equally, you've got to be very careful of inheriting other people's feuds,
Yeah, well, that's fair as well. That's an interesting point. Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, in this world, you start to feel like, well, this person doesn't like that person.
Yeah.
And you
avoid tribalism. Every time I've ever spent any time with Bill, I've adored him. Rich Hall's another one, fantastic. Alan Davis used to be wonderful comic.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he got lucky, I guess, with the acting and everything, and perhaps he could have been a bigger comic talent if he hadn't been so good at doing that as well.
And QI being
fantastic. Yeah.
What about Lee Mack? Lee
Mack is great, very very funny guy. Yeah, hasn't done much stand up for a long time now. Again, he's much more focused on Would I Lie to You?
When they get you on
Bob
that,
Mortimer, of course. I've never been on that. No, Bob Mortimer is the genius on that one, and he's as funny as it gets as well.
Don't you want to nudge them and go, hey, come on, can't just have all these.
I don't know whether I'm a bit too similar to David Mitchell for that. I don't know. The sort of slightly supercilious.
Rub off of each other.
Yes, could do, couldn't we?
It sounds sexual.
I've been on his panel game on the Radio 4 again, The Unbelievable Truth. On those things, yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. I do like that show. I know it's a boring thing to say, but I like that show.
No, it's a great show.
It's just a boring
Bryden
thing to
is a great host as well. Bryden is an amazing impressionist. He's he's the perfect kind that can kind of do impressions of other things as well.
He is funny. He is funny. Anyway, where I've got one more question for you, but where can people follow you and all that stuff?
I am on Twitter at the Simon Evans. That's also the name of my website. And depending on how quickly you get this up on the air, I am on tour at the moment as well. So all my tour dates are on there. The Simon Evans, which hopefully is tongue in cheek and people understand I'm not the only Simon Evans. But funnily enough, there is another Simon Evans on the block now, the chap, a theatre director and writer who wrote something called Staged, which was very popular during lockdown.
Well, don't publicise him.
David Tennant and Michael Sheen, and I got loads of congratulatory tweets.
Oh, well, that's
during
something.
That. Yeah, so that
well
was all right.
done.
Got a bit of a following off the back of that.
I get that off of the singer, Andrew Gold.
Yeah, but...
Thank you for being a friend, Lonely Boy.
Lonely Boy, that's the one I was remembering. What a lonely boy. Yeah.
Thank you.
Never Let Her Go, was that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Never Let Her Slip Away.
Never Let Her Slip Away, yeah.
Never Let Her Go was a Ishiguro novel.
That's true. That's the one
Never
about
Let Me Go.
Clones,
Yes.
which I felt it was a little bit close to my
oh my God,
story.
that's a good point.
I was actually genuinely reading Brave New World when I learned about that.
Oh, wow.
And not just like randomly, but for book club, I was properly reading it hard.
Get some of that Soma into you.
Yeah, exactly.
Just proving I know the book. Yeah, you can't just nod along because then it might look like I don't know the book. So get the Soma into you. Otherwise, people will think I haven't read it and I'm just nodding vacuously. Who is a heretic you admire?
I'm going to go with G.K. Chesterton, even though in a way, of course, he's exactly the opposite. One of his great books is called Orthodoxy, the exact opposite of heresy. But he was kind of a heretic in the world of intellectual thought and dispute in the early 20th century. He held the line. He disputed to enormous effect and great theatricality in the Savoy and so on with George Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells and socialist thinkers and the utopian socialists of that kind. He was the only one who was deeply critical of Stalin. He was deeply critical of eugenics. I find increasingly it's quite interesting how many of the great thinkers of the early and mid-20th century who most accurately anticipated the various troubles we find ourselves in now were quite explicitly Christian in their thinking.
Yeah.
The big one being C.S. Lewis.
Yes. And I'm going to start a whole other thing.
Yeah.
People, please go follow Simon Evans, and he's got a tour at the moment. So he's been brilliant. You know that, or it is great. Hit the like button. Keep watching the videos.